Thanks so much, Wendy, for introducing the discussion we're going to have. I'm really excited to be here. So as Wendy mentioned, I'm joining everybody from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis peoples. I'm excited to introduce the panelists who are going to lead us in this invigorating discussion. So we're joined today by Jasmine Ali from Diversio. So Jasmine leads Diversio's research on racial inequality in the workplace. She has experience working in consulting at McKinsey and Company and previously at the House of Commons in Canada. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Magnolia Perrin, who is the Indigenous Women and Youth Program Officer at the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. Magnolia has come to a number of the consultations that I've been holding across Canada with Indigenous women entrepreneurs. So Magnolia is from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and is a proud member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and she's currently completing her master's in Indigenous nationhood at UVic, focusing on Indigenous economic development and entrepreneurship. Last but not least, pleased to welcome Nadine Spencer. Nadine Spencer is the CEO of Brand EQ Group, a global agency specializing in social change marketing, communications, and public relations. Nadine holds an honors BA in political science from York University. Nadine pioneered Brand EQ Black, Brand EQ's cultural sensitivity arm, whose goal is to work with Fortune 500 companies, banks, governments, and leading nonprofits to look at racial biases in advertising and marketing. Her coined People Matter strategy grabs attention, demands interaction, and generates long-term value for clients. So welcome Jasmine, Magnolia, and Nadine Miigwech for joining us today. The first question that I'd like to pose to our panelists is, so in Canada, we have a growing number of businesses led by Black and Indigenous founders. How can investors better understand the nuances with these unique groups? And Nadine, maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always great to join the hub and participate in these dialogues. So thank you very much. You know, I think, you know, one of the first nuances is to, you know, Steve Covey says, seek first to understand. So I think if we understand through the, you know, so first I must say, you know, you mentioned my my intro, but I'm president of the Black Business and Professional Association as well, an organization that exists to create economic opportunity for Black businesses and advance equity. And so through that space, I think it's important to have an understanding of, we come from the cultural lens, but also the gender lens. And, you know, there's been, you know, a long history of, you know, systemic racism coupled with gender biases, which is very serious. But I think it's important that investors understand the nuances within our unique group. For example, things like, I think one of the most fundamental things is, you know, when we have to worry about childcare as women and as women entrepreneurs, it's always a large challenge. And men, you know, don't have those same considerations. And I think that's the first place, is understanding the cultural, you know, from the perspective, you know, where I sit as the head of the BBPA, and then the gender lens. And of course, number one is you know, when we look at access to capital, you know, it's a big barrier. So understanding what it takes for women entrepreneurs to overcome those, I think, is the first step.
Thank you, Nadine. And you do raise some really important points. I'd like to encourage attendees to share their thoughts and questions in the chat as well. Jasmine, what about you?
Great to be here. Thank you to the other panelists, and thank you, Ashley, for all of that and for hosting this. I'm very happy to participate. And I really, really appreciate the question. Obviously, a very important question always, but particularly relevant now in light of Black Lives Matter. we know the investment industry before any of this was already losing out big time in terms of these discriminatory financing practices that have just left minority-owned businesses just severely underfunded. I think the number was 300 billion in GDP lost in the US, as well as 1.1 million jobs forgone just because of these poor financing decisions, as well as the fact that investors are just missing out on higher potential returns. It's already been proven that these minority-owned businesses headed by diverse teams promise a 30% higher, I believe, median multiple compared to homogenous teams on acquisitions and IPOs. So this was already before any of this. And now, in light of Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing with consumers really being intentional with where their dollars are being directed in what portfolio companies they're going to support, as well as just calling out investors for not putting their money where their mouth is and operating internally with a lens of diversity and inclusion. So now more than ever, it's really important for investors to get behind Black and Indigenous entrepreneurs. And the question is, of course, how, which is really big considering the incredible amount of just unconscious bias in investment decisions. We know that Black and Indigenous entrepreneurs solve for different problems a lot of the time that investors just don't understand. We know that they have different resources, limited resources available to them, and they don't fit that template of a white male Ivy League grad that's now dabbling in entrepreneurship. And then on the investor side of things, we don't have enough representation of Black and Indigenous investors who understand all of this and then can really point to what good investments in minority-owned businesses are, looking past all of those other factors. So really to uncover all of this, it's going to require that investors get data-driven about diversity and inclusion in their own firms so that we can actually hire and retain Black and Indigenous investors, as well as looking at their portfolios and doing the exact same thing.
Thanks, Jasmine, and you raise a really good point. There is data and there are reports that have been produced to prove that even Indigenous women, they're more likely to repay their loans than Indigenous men are, and Indigenous women are starting businesses at twice the rate of non-Indigenous women. Please email me if you'd like to read these reports. I'd be happy to send them to you. And I think that leads perfectly into hearing from our third panelist, Magnolia. Magnolia, perhaps you could touch upon these things and then maybe talk about the special role that Aboriginal financial institutions play and why they're important.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks so much. Yeah, listening to Nadine and Jasmine speak, I had a lot of thoughts running through my mind. Firstly, Nadine spoke about recognizing the intersectionality. And I think when it comes to Indigenous women entrepreneurs, we need to recognize that they're part of two distinct groups. They're Indigenous and they're also women. So I think it's really important that when we're talking about access to capital or access to finance, that we're making sure it's reflective not only their gender, but also relevant to their culture and their circumstances as Indigenous women. And then as Jasmine touched on, I think it's really important for financial institutions to understand, the unique situations for different minority groups such as Indigenous women, Black entrepreneurs. And particularly, Ashley, you just touched on this, but like the research shows, right, that Indigenous women entrepreneurs, they have less write-offs than Indigenous men. They make more calculated business decisions. They're in their business for the long run. And I think that's really important when we're talking about, the value of investing in Indigenous women. And not only for the investor, I think that's really important, but I think we also need to talk about the community benefits. So Indigenous women, they create jobs in their communities, they become role we're talking about them being valuable investments. And then on the AFI side, or Aboriginal Financial Institutions, I just want to talk a little bit about them. So for those of you who are not familiar, Aboriginal Financial Institutions, or owned community-based financial organizations that offer business lending, business support, First Nations. Hello.
Hi, Magnolia. I think we just lost you there for 1 second.
Oh, yeah, I just cut out completely. I don't know where I ended. I hope.
You were talking just about the role that AFIs play, and they represent First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad you guys didn't miss the whole first part. So as I was saying, they support Indigenous businesses. They were created in the late 1980s by Indigenous leaders with support from the government to address the lack of access to capital that Indigenous entrepreneurs were facing then and are still facing today. Today, AFIs have provided over 45,000 loans, totaling over $2.6 billion, filling the finance gap that Indigenous entrepreneurs face. And AFIs are an important and essential part of the Indigenous entrepreneurship ecosystem by addressing the challenges that Indigenous entrepreneurs face, such as access to capital, as I already mentioned, inability to qualify for a loan from a mainstream financial institution, often due to things like lack of collateral, lack of equity. For First Nations who are running a business on reserve, that's often related to the Indian Act, and the inability, for seizure of property, and so businesses are unable to use that as collateral when they're looking for finance, and just other things like a lack of credit history, lower education and income levels, and limited access to markets or financial institutions, often because of their rural or remote locations. And we know Indigenous women have additional challenges, such as things like, again, access to capital and limited financial resources, but also things like childcare, balancing family responsibilities with business responsibilities, inability to work full-time in their business, and systematic barriers and systemic barriers such as sexist bias. So AFIs are unique because they're located within communities that they serve. They're locally developed and flexible to the needs of communities, and they have a lot of knowledge about the clients that they're serving. And often they don't just look at the client's credit history, they look at the whole individual and, think about, okay, what business are they looking to get into? What's that industry doing? Do they have support from their community? And those types of things when they're making, when they're doing their due diligence and reviews of Indigenous, businesses and clients. So I think for those reasons and more, AFIs are critical to supporting Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs. Thanks.
Thanks, Magnolia. And the work that you're doing for Indigenous women and youth entrepreneurs at NACA is so important. And it's just nice to see a national organization take such an important stand in that regard and support all of the AFIs across Canada on these initiatives. Nadine, I wanted to turn it over to you now because I know that your team just re-released their study, and I'm hoping that you could tell us a bit more about your research on the impact of COVID on Black business and the experience you and your members are experiencing.
Yes. The major takeaway from our survey was that Black businesses are not only more susceptible to crises, to a crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic in the economic downturn, but also we found that they were less confident about receiving government and other support through the crisis compared to Canadian businesses on a whole, like what we call mainstream businesses. Black businesses, they have less access to loans and investments and less access to capital, and they have less liquidity and cash reserves, and so they're more likely to permanently close due to the crises. And we believe that the government programs are much needed, but we we found that the businesses weren't able to qualify. And it's interesting, I want to share just a few instances. We know that the SEBA loans are available to everybody. And we've had, strong partners that have said that the banks actually badgered them to take the money, and even though they didn't need it. And we're working with a specific group of Black businesses, and many of them just were told by their bank managers that they didn't qualify, even though that loan is qualified, is available for everyone. And so that's the businesses on a whole. And then when we look at the Black women that have come forth with the same criteria, again, the numbers were quite huge. But I just want to share a little bit of the numbers with you from our survey. So it showed striking disparities between mainstream businesses and the Black businesses. And we weren't able to get, sort of the specific women businesses, but a lot of our survey sort of was like an equitable 50-50 in terms of female-owned versus male businesses. And 80% of Black businesses didn't believe that they were going to get the subsidy, when compared to 37% of the mainstream businesses that had responded to the survey. And when we looked even at a later date on a subsequent review, we found that a lot of the businesses didn't qualify at all, to get any support, which further depreciates their business. And a lot of the businesses, in one area we had 40% of businesses that closed, and of that 40% that closed, 60% of them were women-owned businesses.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that with us today. That kind of leads into the next question. So we do have a really diverse group of participants listening to today's webinar. So Jasmine, I'll pass it over to you now. How can we build bridges towards economic inclusion, and what does true allyship look like within the financial community?
Yeah, those numbers definitely speak volumes. In terms of what the financial community can do, I think firstly, it starts really with taking a stand, announcing that your organization, your institution is an ally. We see that I think 87% of consumers expect firms to take a stance on racial equality. So that's honestly the first step. And then making this a priority in terms of the C-suite, and making sure that you're committed to following up publicly after you take that stand, saying, we know that this is not a moment in time. This is a problem that we are going to continue to iterate on, continue to track our progress on, pivot if necessary, but it's a strong, hard commitment, full stop. And after making that proclamation, I think that looking internally, firstly, to see what are our specific diversity and inclusion pain points with our Black and Indigenous investors, our Black and Indigenous entrepreneurs that we're invested in, and then using those to inform policies, programs, solutions that address those pain points, and then tracking that all over time, repeating the process if necessary. And that's how you're able, again, to follow up publicly and partially save your company's own rear end by being able to do so, because consumers are calling for it. Another thing that's paired with doing all of that is really facilitating an open dialogue on race within your firm, because that's how you're going to continue to unlock those biases that exist, those pain points that exist around diversity and inclusion. And the last thing I would say also is supporting the Black and Indigenous entrepreneurial community outside of your specific business ventures. So that means building out the pipeline. Going in there, VCs are now supporting organizations finally that have been doing amazing work with historically Black colleges in the US, teaching them entrepreneurial skills, teaching them the ins and outs of venture capital and investment management. And these are the Black and Indigenous entrepreneurs of tomorrow. So I think there's a big pipeline problem myth, there's a really strong call to action for VCs, for PEs, to get in there and build that out.
Thanks, Jasmine. Magnolia, what are your thoughts on this? Because the term economic reconciliation has come up a number of times in recent years. So what does that mean to you?
Hi, Ashley. Thank you so much. Yeah, thinking of economic reconciliation, I think it's really important for Indigenous people and for also for Black people and Black communities that, you know, other financial institutions or things like that are turning to Indigenous people, turning to Black communities, asking you know, them for, you know, what can be done, what can we do to support. As I mentioned, right, Indigenous women are part of, you know, two distinct populations. They're Indigenous, they're women. There are programs out there for Indigenous entrepreneurs. There are programs out there for women entrepreneurs, but we really need targeted programming. We need targeted tools and resources, funding that is not only gender specific, but relevant to Indigenous women, to Black women entrepreneurs. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about developing these tools or resources or new programs, especially right now, I know in the last few years, right, this term economic reconciliation and reconciliation in general has, you know, generated a lot of attention, and a lot of organizations and businesses are trying to do their part. And I think that's really great, but we really need to make sure that we're bringing Indigenous people to the table, and we're listening to their voices, and, you know, they know their communities, they know what needs to be done, what's going to work, and then from there, right, we can collaborate and we can build partnerships and work together. So that's really what I think needs to be done in order to, you know, move forward in terms of economic reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. And we're already coming into our last discussion question. I could listen to this panel speak all day. So Jasmine, Magnolia, and Nadine, all of you are working right now towards creating a more inclusive financial industry. How are investors putting diversity and inclusion commitments into practice, and are there best practices that we can look into? Nadine, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the best practice, you know, my daughter, I remember she was 14 at the time, I was talking about something and she said, "Mom, read the room, you know, look around you and read the room." And I think one of the best practices is that if we read the room, that would be the number one. I remember doing a talk with an organization on diversity and inclusion, and then I Googled their corporate C-suite page. So there were 12 individuals, one minority, and 2 women named Helen. So I looked and I said, if I'm looking to join your organization, I have to be a white male or a female named Helen. It's just, you know, and if my name was, you know, they changed they anglicized this person's name to, you know, Rudy, which was and he had another name. So I think if we were intentional about looking around to see who's participating in this space and recognizing that we live in a society that is multicultural and embracing diversity in gender and all of, then I think that's the best place to start in terms of policy.
Thanks, Nadine. If anyone takes anything away from today, let it be read the room. Jasmine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can speak specifically to what we do at Diversio, just because we've seen such incredible results with the investors that we've helped already. And we do this in 2 ways using data and AI. So the first is we really help investors be more inclusive internally. And the second is we help ensure their investment practices result in diverse portfolios in terms of the companies they invest in. And to do this, we look across all different aspects and intersections of diversity. So race, gender, sexual orientation, While we're talking about race today, taking a stand for racial equality means taking a stand for gender equality and all of these different other intersections at the same time. So then in providing this data to investors on the specific pain points as they relate to diversity inclusion, we then recommend specific interventions that target these areas. And this entire process, like I said before, is what allows them to track progress over time, pivot if necessary. And the key to it all is really being data-driven. And then at the same time, we go in and support portfolio companies to do the same thing, which just reinforces a strongly diverse and inclusive portfolio for the firm that's invested in these companies in the first place. And what we're seeing right now in terms of Black Lives Matter south of the border is really reflecting those two things that we already do. The big campaign right now is hire and wire, so hire Black investment professionals and make the wire to Black founders. To hire Black investors, you need to, one, be inclusive internally, so you hire and retain them. And two, to make those wires to Black founders, you have to ensure that your investment practices line up. And again, deferring to the first point, you have those Black investors who understand the specific context of the Black founders. So really the key to it all, I've said it before, I'll say it again, is being data driven. And I think that's going to be very, very important going forward, especially in light of the call to action to report on all of this publicly.
Mm-hmm. I do agree with your point on things being data driven. I know it's a challenge and sometimes in the Indigenous community to find recent data, recent and relevant data. Magnolia, I'll just pass the floor to you to end us off today on your thoughts from an Indigenous lens.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I think definitely if we're thinking about how do we enable factors for success. Sorry, my phone was ringing. So how do we enable Indigenous women entrepreneurs to be successful? And I think that requires, people looking within their organizations and acknowledging that gender bias exists. Look at their programs, look at their services, and, determine how unintentional gender bias exists within these programs and look at ways at eliminating it. There's some really good tools out there, such as the Gender Bias Analysis Plus tool and training that organizations can take advantage. And then we need to think about how can we eliminate some of these barriers to accessing financing that Indigenous women are facing, like changing their criteria so that Indigenous women who are operating part-time or micro businesses are able to access financing and things like microloans. And we really need to, invest the time. Something that we hear in terms of, within Indigenous communities and thinking about how do we, redefine, money and thinking about investment in business there's this idea of relationship capital. So I think it's really important for investors to invest in relationships with their clients and get to know them and understand their passion and their commitment for their businesses. And then just provide opportunities for, training and education for Indigenous women and make sure that we're being mindful of, thinking about things like childcare, thinking about things like transportation and, scheduling these workshops that fit within their schedules. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And even thinking on in an eternal level, we see within our AFIs, for example, there's, some that have, 50% female staff or economic development officers and 50% board members, and 50% of their loans are going towards 2 Indigenous women entrepreneurs. So I think that says something. So I think we need to have representation at the table in leadership positions and decision-making positions. Thanks.
Thank you, Magnolia, and miigwech to Jasmine, Nadine, and you again, Magnolia, for sharing everything that you shared today. I honor everything that you said, and I will hand things back off to our host for the day.
Thanks so much, and really appreciate your insights. And this is one in a series of conversations we're having about these issues. We're really going to be for time today, but I would really encourage you to put questions or offer information in the chat box. We will be doing follow-up. So I'd like now to hand it over to the newest member of my team, Shannon Paxton. Over to you, Shannon.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the warm introduction. I feel so honored to be working with this team of incredible talent that are just really looking at how we advance women's entrepreneurship on so many levels. I am, so excited for this next panel that's looking at innovative financing approaches. And I guess addressing capital, it's the mindset of many leaders today, and from traditional financing to some of the new alternative financing sources that are coming to market, we're seeing a bigger number of emerging financial solutions and people who are working to close the gender gap and many other gaps when it comes to financing. And in the last panel, we heard about what some of those gaps are. And today I'm excited to introduce some amazing women who are trailblazers in their industries. They're breaking barriers, they're creating innovative financing approaches, and they're working to ensure that today we're not leaving anybody behind. So I'm thrilled to introduce my first guest, who is Jill Earthy. Jill, many of you will know, she's the interim CEO of Women's Enterprise Center, which is based in BC. Jill is an accomplished entrepreneur who has successfully built and sold 2 companies, and one of the biggest allies for women entrepreneurs that I have ever met. Jill is an influential Women in Business honoree and an award winner in so many ways, and so incredibly well deserved. And Jill, you're also in hot demand, so I'm going to put you in the hot seat right now. We're going to get going right away, but welcome, Jill. I'm going to start with my first question to you, Jill, but when we take a look and we talk about the finance ecosystem, so often, just give a quick overview. What is the financial ecosystem?
Oh, that is a big question. It's a very complex ecosystem. I think that's why we're all here, right? Because we're all trying to navigate it to make sure, as you said, no one is left behind. And I know for me, most of my career, I definitely have been focused on supporting women entrepreneurs, and particularly the access to capital piece, and really about making sure that all of the pieces, I think that's where you're going, fit together, right? Each entrepreneur has their own unique funding puzzle, and the pieces that come together from that can look quite different, right? So when you look at the ecosystem, I mean, it's all of us who are here trying to learn to better support the entrepreneurs. It's obviously the traditional funders. We've talked about the financial institutions and the credit unions, and I'd love to share an example about a partnership there. And then obviously angel investors and venture capitalists and equity crowdfunding is a new opportunity specifically for women entrepreneurs, I believe, as well as we're going to talk later about reward-based crowdfunding. It's all of the pieces coming together to form a unique puzzle.
Yeah, I threw that zinger at you there, just really, before we start this off, just to show how wide this ecosystem actually is. It's not just that there's one solution. There are so many different parts of this, and I think we often underestimate just how massive and how many players are actually involved in this. I know that you have another panel to get to, and this week there was an incredibly exciting announcement between the Women's Enterprise Center and Van City that we're calling the Unity Women Entrepreneurship Program. What does this mean for women entrepreneurs? Tell us a little bit about this partnership and how it's changing the capital game through access to capital and access to some other tools as well.
Yeah, and I'd love to just take a quick step back too, because I think many of you are familiar with Women's Enterprise Center, of course, which is one of 4 women's enterprise initiatives that are funded by Western Economic Diversification in the 4 Western provinces. Because we each have our own loan funds. We've been doing this work for 25 years, offering loans up to $150,000. I think the key piece there is we're a development lender. So we have some flexibility in how we work with women entrepreneurs. We don't just provide the capital, but again, we all know the importance of the capital combined with the mentorship, education and business advisory services. And I think that's why, so our repayment rate is over 94%. That was indicated before too. We know women want to repay. And so we have flexibility to extend payment terms. Obviously in this current situation, we were proactive. We reached out to our loan clients and said, what do you need? So we were able to defer payment. We were able to forgive interest, which of course most of our clients took us up on. And now looking ahead as we move into this next phase, we've gone back to them and said, what do you need? And we've been able to offer interest-only payments for the next 6 months to give them some breathing room, right? But So we have this experience here, and it's pretty incredible because we're able to be flexible, and that's everything, right? So I would love to see more models like that. But building on that, I'm also in my role right now on the board of WEOC, which is the Women's Entrepreneurship Organizations of Canada. And so we were having a conversation about 2 months ago about, SEBA, all of these programs are coming out, which are great. We all know here that some women entrepreneurs have been left behind, and the government's been iterating, which has been great. But we were curious, what percentage of these SEBA loans are going to women entrepreneurs? So we decided to reach out to our local credit unions in each of our provinces to start there and ask the question, how many women entrepreneurs are accessing SEBA? Surprisingly, that's not being tracked. So then we couldn't ask the next question, right? Which is, it's the access piece, but it's also, how many are eligible? So that started a conversation, certainly here in BC, with our partner Van City, who already was a leader in the space and was being very progressive and had already initiated a number of innovative loan products. And so we were able to work in partnership with them because as soon as we asked the question, they were interested in learning more. And working collectively with us to design this new program. Sharon, as you mentioned, the Unity Women's Entrepreneurship Program. So we're partnered so that women entrepreneurs can access, again, a loan fund, very favorable terms, up to $150,000, but then they get access, streamlined access to additional support services through Women's Enterprise Center. And I have to say, this week, it's been unbelievable. We launched it on Monday. The applications that have been coming in, it's extraordinary. So we know the gaps exist, and we're trying to all work together, obviously, to find different ways to fill them. So we're excited about that, and we hope that's a model for other both credit unions and financial institutions across the country. But we have a lot more work to do, as we know.
And Jill, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think you just touched on something so important because we heard the notion of data, this absence of data. And so I guess I encourage you to keep talking about the importance of data because we will never know if the actions that we're taking are actually making a difference and hitting going to the pockets of those who need it the most. And so we can't make change without that data. So this is a great start. So really looking forward to following along in this journey. And if you wanted to say a couple more words, but I do know that you have to get to another panel. So
at least you don't have to go far. I just wanted to also comment. I mean, I think this is as we all know, such an incredible time of change, of evolution, and it's so powerful. And so one of the other areas of interest that I've had, of course, I was the chief growth officer at a platform called Front Funder, so an online investment platform. And my dream, because I went there because I saw it as a more efficient way, a more inclusive way, more transparent way for entrepreneurs to access capital, but also, of course, for all of us and the average Canadian to potentially participate, both as debt or equity. And I think that's really critical too, that there's flexibility in how those platforms are used. And so, my dream is really to create an inclusive platform where we can all come together, a community to really rally around and use some of the new regulations that are coming through in Canada. It's been slower because it's complicated, and Carly's going to talk a little bit about the reward-based crowdfunding. The equity and debt side is a little more complicated, but we're close. We're there. We're almost there with some of the new regulations. So I'm really passionate about that and how we can put those pieces together. And I know I'm in conversations with some of you already. So thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Best of luck on your next call. And I'll just segue over to Carly. And we heard a new word called crowdfunding. For many of you, it might be a new word. For many of you, you might actually know what crowdfunding is. My next guest is Carly Wells. Carly is the senior manager at ATB Financial, located in Alberta, and she runs the ATB Booster platform. And this is ATB. It's a crowdfunding platform that has served to, to help more entrepreneurs raise capital for their companies without giving up equity, giving them the opportunity to validate their product. And we're going to hear so much more about that. Carly Wells, welcome to the conversation. I'm so excited to have you here, Carly. I know that you and I have worked on crowdfunding for several years together, and you, first of all, are such a passionate advocate for women entrepreneurs, more vulnerable entrepreneurs as well. Let's talk about crowdfunding. So tell me, what is the ATB Build Her Business crowdfunding platform?
So the Build Her Business, well, one, thank you for having me. I guess I should jump into that first. But our Build Her Business platform, we created a few years ago just to focus really around women in entrepreneurship. And there's been so many studies done that women are actually, 33% better, Shannon, at crowdfunding than men are. So we decided to really dig into that and create this program that we just focused on women for 1 month. They raised funds. We had a very successful last couple of years that we ran it. The first year we had, I think, was it 23 businesses that ran? And 87% of them were successful in hitting their funding goal. And then just this last year, we had 32 women participate. And again, we had a really high success rate on that. So it was really exciting. And I don't know what else to add. It was awesome. The way we do Build Her Business is we created a Facebook group for all these women to come together and chat, and they really had that sense of community together. Whereas usually with crowdfunding, you think about Kickstarter, Indiegogo, those other rewards-based crowdfunding platforms, they don't have a platform for people to come together and go through the same emotions together, right? It's a very emotional process doing crowdfunding, especially when you're asking for money from people in your inner network, and a lot of people are uncomfortable asking for that money. So it was really great to have a platform and an area for those women to come together and really lift each other up.
Yeah, Carly, I think I'm going to ask you a little bit more specifically about rewards-based crowdfunding, because Jill had sort of mentioned there's different types of crowdfunding. Some have been in Canada with regulations, some weren't in Canada. So we really have leveraged the rewards-based crowdfunding platform here in Canada. Can you talk to specifically, like, what does it mean to create a rewards-based crowdfunding campaign? What is the intention behind it? And how is it changing the access to capital game for women in particular?
Yeah, so with rewards-based crowdfunding, you see a lot more startups come through there for them to test out their business idea and make sure that it's something that people actually want. So the way rewards-based crowdfunding works is they pre-sell a product, service, or experience to the crowd. And most of the times reward-based crowdfunding is an all or nothing platform. So that means you have to hit that goal. So you have a $5,000 goal, you have to hit that goal, or you don't get to see any of those funds. And you've also, if you don't get that goal, then maybe that's not the right product right now for people. However, we've kind of switched models right now with ATV Booster. Just during COVID, we've opened that up for just basically for people to have an online market that don't have an online presence to sell products, services, or experiences right now. And if it's that service or experience that was closed during COVID-19, at least they can pre-sell it for when things do start to kind of get to a different normal for all of us. And I think for women, though, it's been a really great place for them to tell their stories. And one thing we learned from Build Her Business last year, we had a couple of women that weren't successful, unfortunately, but the feedback we got from them of how we put them outside of their comfort zone in terms of they built a huge network, and that was more valuable for them than the fact that they didn't get the money. I remember that woman said to us, she said, that $5,000 doesn't make or break my business. She's like, if anything, I've now gained so many more customers outside of all this. And I really went door to door and I made new friends and learned lots of great things.
That's great. And I do want to applaud ATB as well, because you had a 10% participation rate from Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And also, I think what's important about that is it's crowdfunding really relies on having networks. And I think what's interesting is that the demand is there. So what are you seeing in terms of the population that's coming to crowdfunding, and how is it helping more vulnerable entrepreneurs? So not just women, when we add the intersectionalities, like, what are we seeing? What are you seeing? I'm so used to be with ATB, I keep saying we. What are you seeing in terms of the demographic shift of those who are seeing this as a way to access capital in ways that they didn't have access to before?
Yeah, for a great example of something that we just did last week, we held an Indigenous market, because usually with ATB, we usually have a huge event that goes on, and we partner up with Boyle Street, and we do a great market for all these Indigenous women. And actually, this year we had 24 artists total, 16 of them being women. And it was really cool. We ran it from Tuesday to Friday for us, and 120 pieces sold with all these artists, and they raised over $15,000, which was awesome in a few days. And so that was really cool, because I know for us in the past, it's been a bit of a struggle in terms of, for some of those Indigenous women trying to sell on our platform, because different financial issues are there, and there's so many different issues, technology, but we got so much great feedback from all the vendors on this event in terms of they were so used to one artist in particular, she's like, I've never sold anything past Boyle Street. That's it. Like, that's only been my community. And now she was across Alberta, and she had people reaching out to her after this market ended, asking for more pieces from her. So lots of cool different things, and we're seeing lots of different people coming.
Well, and I love the fact that people get to validate their products on here and really test the market out. And it's a really great way to pivot. So continued great work to you. I love the focus that you're placing on a more diverse and inclusion lens with the crowdfunding platform, and looking at how we can help all groups, in a great pivot during a time of COVID, where it wasn't an all or nothing raise. It was raise what you can, raise what you need for your business, because it was a very I would say a quick way for capital to get into the pockets of Albertans. And so congratulations on that, Carly. And thank you for your time today. I'm not sure, we've got, I mentioned earlier, I've got all these trailblazing women on this call, and some of them are coming in from other calls. So I'm not sure if Vicky Saunders is here on the line with us yet. She is, I'm getting the nod. Yeah. So wonderful. Carly, thank you so much for joining us. Keep us posted on Build Your Business. We look forward to following that journey. So thank you so much. And Vicky Saunders, welcome to the call. Super excited to see you again as well. Many of you know Vicky. She is a trailblazer in this space, as I mentioned. She's an entrepreneur, an award-winning mentor, advisor to the next generation of change makers. And Vicky, you're just a leading advocate for entrepreneurship and using entrepreneurship and other mechanisms to create positive transformation in the world. I want to invite you to talk about SheEO. I want to be able to talk to you about asking your thoughts on what gaps are there in the investing market, like what existed when you came up with SheEO. What was there for you?
Hi, it's nice to see you, Shannon. And hi everyone, great to be here. I mean, let's flip it around. What gaps weren't there?
No.
Like, just kind of flip it around. There's literally, I was just on a call with our US activators, and this thing that I just keep paying attention to over and over is 51% of the population gets 2.2% of the venture capital globally. And if you're Latina, it's 0.32%. And if you're a Black woman entrepreneur, it's 0.0006%. I mean, it's like statistically impossible that this exists, that these numbers are the way they are without massive structural inequalities built into all of our systems. And I think we're seeing the result of that every single day as the curtains are pulled back on what the economy looks like and the biases that exist out there. And I think, it's incredibly frustrating as a woman on this planet to have to prove everything before you get any support. Men are funded on potential, women are funded on proof. It's like, what's the business model as to why that should happen? I'm like, why don't you have to create a business model for why 97% goes to men? Like, how about you justify that instead of me justifying why I should get 2.2 or 3%? So there's my rant. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I think we're in upside down land, and there's so much challenge. I was on a podcast this morning with a good friend of mine who does a lot of systems change and gender lens investing globally. And one of the big challenges that we just sort of see in the economy is that technical assistance and a lot of supports for women entrepreneurs are driven to kind of change you into what the capital that's available wants to fund versus the capital, looking at what kinds of businesses are out there run by women and matching that. So 98% of our economy in Canada is small and medium-sized business, and most of us need a low-interest loan, or we need support to find customers, right? And it's just not out there. Our Bank for Entrepreneurs charges 6 to 9%, that's just really problematic. And we have a narrative in the world that the only kind of business that matters is one that's venture funded, that's going to be a unicorn. And so it's just super confusing out there right now, I think, if you're an entrepreneur, because we just go, oh, I need to have venture capital to be successful. But yeah, your business isn't a venture funding kind of business. And everyone's trying to turn everything into a venture funded business, including a lot of our government programs. And so I think there's just a lot of transparency needed, a lot of sort of, I think Wendy is doing an unbelievable job of trying to put out information and data for us to understand what the reality is, because we tell stories of a reality that isn't everyone's reality. It's only reality of a few people. So I think there were a lot of things missing. I personally, when we first started, we created a 0% interest loan with CEO, which we're still doing. And people were like, what is that thing? That's not a thing. A 0% interest loan. What is that? Like, I don't get it. And so if you're a traditional finance person, you just think that's really strange, but we have negative interest rates in Europe right now. And so I really, I'm living in a future in my own head, which hopefully will be here soon, where we're actually putting money into the hands of social innovators to go out and create the kind of social impact we need. We already know how to make money and make more money this way. But what we don't know how to do is actually create businesses that create a better world. That's a big problem.
So, it's such an interesting question that you raised, because so many women that we speak to, they're social enterprises. There's an element to wanting to do better for the world. And you often talk about the world's to-do list. And that's something that potentially the financial industry hasn't wrapped its head around, because we've always looked traditionally at what is a successful business. How is some of the work that you're doing, how is that changing the mindset? Like, do you feel that you're able to move the needle in how people are thinking about finance and the types of businesses that we see as being critical to our socioeconomic structures as well? Like, how is this changing? How is this picture changing?
I mean, I would say we're a bit ahead of the curve still around this, but we're starting to see this change happen. I mean, with the lack of leadership, I would just say globally, and the challenges that we're facing as society and community, there is going to come a time not far from now where we just go, why would we spend any money at all on something that wasn't a priority for our environment? And as you look at what's happened around COVID, the businesses that provide essential services that are actually solving a major challenge that we have in front of us tend to be doing better than those that are just trying to flip it and make money for the sake of money. That's actually not creating a deep value in society. So I'm starting to see a shift in that direction. And also, I mean, I don't know how many people on the call are entrepreneurs, but almost all the stuff that we see come our way are, most women that I see starting businesses really want to create a difference. They want to solve a real problem that matters, that has a point, as opposed to create the next Angry Birds so that they can make $5 million, and then give it away. Like, what's the point? So most people I see, especially in the younger generation coming up, are much more interested in how do you fuse together making money and doing good at the same time. I think it's a vibe on the planet right now that's really, it's prime for us.
What's been a key learning for you throughout this journey? Like, how has this changed you, or what changes have you even made in CEO during this path that you've been on?
Yeah, one of the things that's really amazing, and maybe I'll put you guys all on gallery view so I can see everyone, but just as a show of hands, how many people here would help someone if they asked you right now? Hands up. Okay, you guys looking across that? Yeah. And how many people like asking for help? And there we go. That's what I've learned, which is that we're really conditioned to think we have to do this on our own, and that we should know how to do all these things, and we're quite isolated. And when you come together in a spirit of radical generosity, which we have sort of at the heart of CEO, and you go, imagine if you were surrounded by radically generous women and you had all this help around you, everyone wants to help you, and it felt like a safe space to ask for help. We all start to really thrive a lot more. And the thing that I've learned is just this conditioning to keep us isolated and separate keeps us in a scarcity space, and feels like there's not enough to ever go around. And one of the things that we've really learned in our CEO community is everything you need is here. The hard part is you have to step in and ask. And so how do you build that muscle? How do we each build that muscle to ask for help? And I'll speak for myself, like, oh my God, I was like the queen of like, go off and do it on your own, put your head down and just work harder. And that's just like crazy making. I want to have a big impact in the world. And the only way to do that is to like get with a group of others, and you can go so much farther together. So that's a little painful learning. But when you do start to do that, everything's so much easier when we come together.
And you speak of together, and I think it's just a great segue to where my mind is going now. And I think that when I talk about this financial ecosystem, like we are all in this together to really start solving and learning from each other and learning some of these best practices. And, you know, as I work with Wendy to really understand with this financial ecosystem and all the different pieces to it, just how complex it is. The one thing that I'm really excited about through this is the women that I'm meeting in finance, and how the women are really from different perspectives and different backgrounds, even from a career perspective, like who's coming into the finance game right now to change this. So I guess in closing, what can the overall financial ecosystem learn from the CEO model?
So much. Well, you know, I think we're in a real transition from the old world to the new world. We have a really big problem of inequality right now because 5 people have the same wealth as half the planet. And so the economic model and the financial models that we have really have nowhere to go. This is a big problem. Like, you know, Bezos is going to own all of us, and then what, right? Like, what happens after that? So I think what we can start to learn is when you start to redistribute capital to the kinds of businesses that are strengthening society, that are creating the new socially and environmentally sustainable jobs, that come up with new business models around zero waste. When we start to see that we could use business to transform our communities, we will all be better off. And so as CEO scales up and we have 68 ventures now, and as we get to that 10,000 a year that we want to be celebrating, you can show what an alternative economy to this extractive economy would look like. And that's what I'm really hoping that we're able to demonstrate, so that we transform all of our communities.
Amazing work, and if anyone can do it, Vicki, it's you, and we're all here to cheer you on.
All of us together. Thank you.
All of us together. And with that, I'm going to close this section. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to throw it back to our hosts, and we've got some questions coming up in the chat, but we are going to go into a Q&A period. And so great time to bring your questions. Wendy, I'm going to pass it back over to yourself and to Megan.
Thanks so much. And I'm very puzzled because I see a note in chat that says, "Thank you all, I have to jump on another call." Oh, it's a different Wendy. That's why I'm confused. I thought someone was impersonating me. Anyway, we have a few minutes. We have a few minutes for questions. I know the chat has been going throughout, and people have been asking for specific follow-up and information and so on. But we have a few minutes for discussion, and then we are actually going to talk about what I think is a really promising new initiative that really is Vicki's brainchild, and that was she developed an AskGive platform for CEO, and we had a discussion with her and Paulina Cameron and decided we would experiment with building that out across the country. So Megan and Paulina will talk about that at the end of the call. But just wondering if if anyone has any questions or suggestions, that because the purpose of this is really to kick off the work that Shannon's going to be doing with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub to try to bridge between some of the programs that are specifically targeting women and making sure that we're finding ways to scale and replicate those, while at the same time working with the mainstream financial institutions to see to what extent we can move them towards more open and equitable processes. And it's a challenging task, but many of you have heard us say that there's $2 billion or thereabouts that has been designated for the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy in Canada, which is great, but there's so much other money that's being invested in other ways that women really don't have access to, and certainly racialized, Indigenous, and other diverse women don't as well. So we're trying to tackle both those things at the same time. So I'm just wondering if there are any questions or comments. Question from Suzanne. My Brad. Megan, Suzanne, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can. I hope it makes sense. Hi, everyone. I have a question. Thank you. That was so inspiring, both panels. I'm very pumped by this. So what would Shannon and this panel see as some initiatives that we can use in WEC or within the network to work with the mainstream institutions to better train their personnel with our evidence base? So notwithstanding what Vicki just said about whole new models, which are really exciting, is this something we can and should do, and what should we do to better train those folks at the other end who are obviously subject to some subject to or the subject of some barriers for women?
Vicki, do you want to start with that one? I'll take it at the end, but
I'll jump right in on that. Sure. Yeah, is this being recorded? Yeah, no, I'm just teasing. So I think to an earlier point, I was actually kind of shocked the SEBA loans aren't being tracked from a gender data. Like, hello, if we just track the data, this would show a lot. And so I think that component would be amazing. And we see a number of banks sort of jump in and aggregate together all the amount of capital they've ever loaned out to women and say, look how much we're loaning to women, like it's new. But it's not really new. It's money that was already going out the door. So I think if we could look at it that, especially in the institutions that are government funded, because it's taxpayer money.
You,
right?
though.
Huh? So.
I'm saying, like, nobody.
oh, hey, Bianca. There you go.
Yeah. But I think that's just the simplest thing, is to track the data and show the data. And that will change so much behavior.
Okay.
I would agree to that comment wholeheartedly. We need the data to be able to start making some better informed decisions and evidence-based decisions. And right now, from my perspective, it's a challenge that we see at a federal level, at a government level. We see it at a financial institution level. And quite frankly, there was never a pull to, there was never really a need to start tracking by gender from the financial institutions, and it wasn't ever part of regulatory conditions as well. So there's always been some limitations there. So now it's kind of a catch-up game, and I know there's some great folks that are on this call too that are also working to make a change in this space, and I welcome them to share their comments as well, because I know that we've got a few great people out there in the gallery.
Other comments? If I can just add to what Vicki said, I think the data and the transparency are massively important, but we also need the advocacy. We know that some of the biggest, a lot of mainstream organizations have diversity and inclusion strategies. A lot of mainstream organizations are subject to employment equity legislation. They're now subject to Bill C-25, which will require more reporting on boards and so on. But so transparency is important, but building in the accountability and the advocacy, being prepared to actually share that data, look at that data, and comment on that data, and put our money where our mouths are, I think is critically important. And that's, I'm a big believer in using procurement as a lever, using, Vicki and I have talked about making sure that we are applying a gender and inclusion lens to every cent the government is putting out the door at every single level. And we as consumers have to communicate that these things are important. We have to actually use that data to shape our behavior, because for the most part, large organizations are chasing markets one way or the other. So I just wanted to add my 2 cents in.
Thank you, all of you.
Wanda, did you want to make a comment? Maybe you can introduce the work you do and add.
We also have a question from Paulina in the chat that I can read out after Wanda.
Okay.
Certainly, thank you, Wendy. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, I want to add that varying abilities is a huge part of that. So often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, varying abilities are either at the bottom, fall to the bottom, or not mentioned at all. And the reality is, in Canada, we're looking at 1 in 5 people, and this totals around the world 1.3 billion people with varying abilities. 80% are invisible. Often people think the opposite. They think the majority of varying abilities are visible, and that's because of the symbols that we use around assistive devices. It's not true. And if we continue to overlook individuals with varying abilities the way that we have, it's to our detriment. It's to our detriment across all systems: health, economic, social, government, because we are people who have talent and skills like everyone else. We want to contribute to our potential. And one of the sayings is that the dis in disability is not actually the condition, it's the barriers in society. So please, I will continue to drive home the importance in terms of the entrepreneurship ecosystem, in terms of diversity and inclusion programs, in terms of across the board financial support, everything that we're talking about today, which is so crucial for underrepresented groups. Please always remember that varying abilities are part of that. And of course, if you look at the varying communities around the intersectional approach, it gets worse and worse. So women of color, Indigenous women with varying abilities, the story is even a sadder one. This is the time. We have the pathways in front of us to change this. This is the time. So we can do it.
I just wanted to add to what you said. Ironically, when you look at the surveys of women with disabilities and others with disabilities, among the principal accommodations people want, flexibility in work and the ability to work at home, and also variable work hours. COVID has actually enabled us potentially to accommodate people with disabilities in a way that we've never been able to before. And I think as we're rebuilding, we need to keep these things in mind. I'll move on because I think we're just about out of time. Shannon, you said that Paulina
Yes.
had another.
Paulina had a question. I took a picture of it because I kept losing it in the chat. Wondering if anyone has seen a collection of company or organizations D&I and anti-racism policies in one place. We've had some of our entrepreneurs ask for specific examples that they can learn from and apply as a next step after their learning. So a great question. I don't know if we have an answer to that. I don't, but I think a great takeaway for us. But if anyone here has wants to comment on that.
Well, one of the things the Diversity Institute has done is compile best practices around not just HR policies, but everything from top to bottom in an organization, including marketing, procurement, and so on. And I know Diversio does similar work, and so do others. So if that's something that's interesting, maybe we can plan a follow-up webinar on that.
Yeah,
I think we are sort of at the point in the discussion. I'd like to hand it off now to Megan and Paulina and give them the last few minutes.
Hey, Paulina, I think you're on mute there.
All right, thanks. I was trying to find my button moving between the two screens. Someone always has to be the person that does that, right? And so let's round it out at the very end. So hi, everyone. For those of you I haven't met, nice to see many familiar faces. My name is Paulina. I'm the CEO of the Forum for Women Entrepreneurs. We're a national charity that's been supporting women entrepreneurs with mentorship and education for the last 19 years. We're physically based in Vancouver, BC, but our programming is available and supportive of women across the entire country. And I feel like you segmented it really well, Shannon, in terms of who was speaking, because Vicki did such a great job of introducing the concept behind the sharing platform. So the big vision here was how can we really help bridge us as a community of women or women entrepreneur support organizations, and therefore empower communities of women entrepreneurs to support one another and actually practice community as a verb. I've been using that a lot with the work we've been doing at FWE, is how do we turn community into a verb and actually bring to life the support that we know we all want to give one another. How can a woman entrepreneur who's based on Vancouver Island connect with a woman in New Brunswick, connect to a woman in Nunavut and share her experience and lend support and insight? And as Wendy had said earlier, one of the side benefits of COVID is we are able to connect more closely together, and that those pieces and the borders between also our provinces and our organizations can be blurred, and we can truly benefit from it all. So I don't know, Shannon, if we're going to share the link in the chat, but maybe we could share it now. So for those of you who haven't yet been introduced to it, the platform that was developed is a platform for women entrepreneurs to be able to post asks and gives. And it's really intuitive to use. When you first sign on to it, you create an account, it sends you a pin, and then you're kind of off to the races. You'll see in there's 6 different categories, and you can segment your ask based on the urgency of it. So, if you're looking to hire someone and you want to get that out, or perhaps you have a supplier call next week and you want to speak to someone who's maybe already worked with that supplier, or you need to get an introduction to someone, you can map your urgency, and you can also say where you're based if it is a location and context specific need. So we have just over 360 women entrepreneurs on it right now, and we know that the magic is going to be in all of us activating it together. Every platform we know, garbage in, garbage out, and so it'll take all of us collectively for this to be a really powerful and sticky tool. So on our end, what FW is doing, and the invitation, I open it up to all of you, is we are doing weekly calls on Wednesday, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, where we open it up to our community, but also any other community and any other women entrepreneurs, where we practice asking and giving together on a Zoom call and go directly into this app. And we actually spend time posting in the ask section, as well as responding to the gives. Awesome, thank you for posting this. So you can take a look at how it engages. It's very intuitive and simple to use. And my other offer, so firstly, is I'll post the link to sign up for the Zooms. Please feel free to share it with your groups, but also, and I shared this last time, we would be so happy to co-host a dedicated Zoom specifically for your group. So we've been now doing numerous ones of these and have flexed our facilitation muscle around it, and would be so happy to extend that to any of the groups. So we are actually doing a few of them. Impact Ottawa Hub, we're doing one lunch and learn with one of the groups, and then a couple others have since reached out. But basically we're structuring it. We need about 45 minutes to an hour, and then your community can come on, we can do it live, we can walk through it together so that there is comfort in using it and it starts engaging and activating. Yesterday, last night, I received an email from a woman who had posted something, and she's actually based in New Brunswick, and someone responded, and she now has a new legal partner based in Alberta who's doing all her pro bono work for a major contract she just got to export to Europe. So minimum size group will you facilitate? Really open, and I would say it depends what would help with your group. On our group this Wednesday, we only had 15, and it was such a rich and powerful conversation. And then in another group we facilitated, we had 200. And so depending on the size, we can facilitate kind of breakout rooms or do it all in one room. We can navigate based on what shows up, and we can maybe combine with other groups. So if there are perhaps, 4 groups in Alberta that want to do it together for Alberta women entrepreneurs, we can flex that. I'll pop my email into the chat. Wendy or Shannon, I don't know if you wanted me to cover anything else with it, but what I will really say is that it will take all of us collectively using it for it to be really activated, and consider it as an additional thing that you can offer of value to the women in all of your networks. Everyone here on the call does such tremendous work between the various programs and supports that you offer. This is another way for your entrepreneurs to see you as a leader and to really utilize and activate community and be even more engaged with one another and make Canada smaller for our women entrepreneurs.
What a great segue. That's really appreciate that, Paulina. And I've sat in on some of these calls, which originally I think Paulina and Megan envisaged as sort of training sessions. But the reality is, and Vicky had kind of prefigured this. The reality is often what comes out of the calls are new connections and links. So it is very, it's inspiring to see what happens when you just give women opportunities to connect. And while there are many geographically focused service providers who are doing great work, sometimes you've got someone who wants to export potatoes to Poland in, PEI, who could actually benefit from talking to somebody in Manitoba. So we're not trying to replace any of the great work others are doing through those local networks. We're trying to figure out how we can knit the pieces together, because I think one of my observations is that we talk about an ecosystem. We don't really have a very good ecosystem. Some places do. I think, BC is particularly strong with the pieces working together, Manitoba perhaps as well. But certainly Ontario does not have an ecosystem. And a woman in somewhere like Toronto can go in one door, get support or not get support, but when she's finished, she has nowhere else to go. And so we're trying to constantly figure out ways that we can better knit the pieces together. So if someone comes in one door, they will be directed to where they can get help, even if that was not the place to start. So that's really what underpins this. And if any of you have ideas for other initiatives or themes or topics, we're happy to engage and try to organize and coordinate things. We have a number of events coming up that Megan will communicate with you all about. With that, Megan, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Wendy. We do have a fairly exciting lineup for this summer. We're just putting the finishing touches on a webinar series so that we can keep having these conversations about important topics and doing a bit of an in-depth dive into the data, where the gaps are, and how we can better support and advocate for the ecosystem. As I think it just popped into the chat, my team is also later today, once we get off this call, going to be updating the website with some additional sharing platform sessions. The ones that we've been leading so far have been so much fun, so uplifting, and we did really envision them as originally a bit of an orientation session, but we found that the demand, Paulina, like you said, practicing community as a verb to be really quite of interest to the community. So I hope you'll join us for a future session. And also, last but very not least, I'll be sending around shortly a feedback survey for the work that the WEC is doing. Please fill it out and let us know how we can improve both our services and better support the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And again, thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks for my team for helping, and big welcome to Shannon. I feel like I really scored on being able to pull her into our vortex, because I think she has some really unique skills that will help build this going forward. So thanks to all of you, and we'll talk again soon.